Hello world, my name is Dakota, and these are my design journals. For this design journal, I'm going to talk over a playthrough of my latest prototype. This is Synthwave, a level design concept made in the style of a Zelda dungeon, heavily inspired by music. My focus was on level design, and while I did spend a lot of time refining the combat and general game feel of our Daft Punk hero, I'll save that discussion for another video. First, what do I mean by a Zelda dungeon? I've created a number of rhythm and music challenges and strung them together using the rooms of this dungeon space. The puzzles and encounters found in each room challenge the player in an immediate way, but, like many Zelda dungeons, there's also a larger meta puzzle of understanding the space, how it works, and how to manipulate it. My goal was to encourage the player to explore the space, understand it, and demonstrate their mastery of it by successfully navigating through the dungeon. I use 3 types of lock and key pairs in the dungeon. First, we have simple locks and keys. Second, we have the traditional key item that the player finds, which allows them to open up previously unavailable spaces. And finally, the dungeon has what I'm calling the Big Boolean, a switch or toggle that changes the state of the dungeon on a macro level. By using all 3 of these lock and key mechanisms, the player is able to successfully navigate forward and proceed to the end of the dungeon. We can see in our first room, the player is introduced to the hedron. Those will come into play later, and later when we see them, I'll make a note about the line above them. This is a good example of introducing the player to a room early on that they're unable to solve to indicate to the player that there's going to be some backtracking involved in this game. Something else to note about this first room is the colors that you see by each of the doors. In playtest, it was revealed to me that players have a hard time navigating because a lot of the rooms look alike, so I needed to make them visually distinct. This was mostly a product of the fact that this art is basically blockout art with a lot of neon colors, which was a way that I was able to make something look cool without having any artistic talent. So, you gotta work around your constraints, I guess. On that note, everything that you see, except for the puppet, rig, and basic navigation animations, so movement and jump, everything else is authored by me. So in this room, we see the base pads for the first time. This is a core mechanic of this dungeon, and I spent a lot of time trying to get them to work right. The idea is that they give you a simple lift when you jump, so long as you jump on the beat. Early on, I had a lot of trouble. Players were bouncing off of pads that they were landing on, just kind of getting knocked all around, so I spent a whole hell of a lot of time tweaking the behavior of those pads to get them to feel right. This is the dungeon's Big Boolean. By toggling the bass boost, the player is reinforced with a total look and feel change, and now the bass pads are shooting red instead of pink. The player quickly discovers that by jumping on the pads when they're red, they're launched way further than they would be otherwise. Even though it's just fluff, I spent a lot of effort reinforcing the bass pad stuff with secondary and tertiary cues. For instance, the cape is on this character purely so that I can make the cape move when he's standing on a heavy bass pad. You can really feel and hear these bass pads in this dungeon. Now if the player tries to use the bass pads and return the way they came, they're repelled by the wall of sound. So instead they need to find alternate routes. Quick note on the green musical notes, the coins. They don't do anything, I just use them as signposts to show the player how they should be navigating the space, especially in places where my playtesters had a hard time. I also use them as reward structure later, you'll see. I had some ideas about some big rewards I wanted to hide in the dungeon, like heart pieces from a typical Zelda game, but without taking the time to implement them, I just filled rooms with notes when I wanted to reward the player. So this switch is something that will come up in the future. So this is basically my second room in a 3-room series of puzzles, the first being the hedrons. Player learns that the hedrons smash, and they also learn that these switches only activate when they're pressed with strong force, like from a big fall. also like this room because I've got a platforming section here where I've outlined the steps that the player has to take, but you'll notice up top these pads are not outlined. I read somewhere that level design should be easy and medium and optionally hard, and so this is an example of that, where if the player wants to, they can challenge themselves with the more difficult platforming section and then rewarded with a whole bunch of notes here. I like this space because it introduces the mage enemy, and at first the player is not able to deal with that mage very easily at all. It sits in the center of those pads, they kind of have to play around with timing, but the player will soon get a new item that'll help deal with those enemy types much more easily. Now the player has the tool. They've got the key item for the dungeon, Singing Shot, which is just a ranged ability, but notably it's a ranged ability that can trigger switches from afar, which is going to unlock a lot more of this dungeon to the player. Additionally, if they wanted to, the player could destroy the mage way easier now that they have Singing Shot. This room is another example of optionally hard content. You'll notice that the music fades away and we're left with only a single melody. The melody goes mid, low, high, and if the player mimics that pattern, they're rewarded. Another note on the music, since we're in and out of this mage room, I did write all this music myself. I had a lot of fun with that, and the music's dynamic too, so when you're in combat, you're going to get some additional tracking, and each of the enemy types also has a unique melody that they add layered onto the music, which I thought was kind of fun. So this particular space here required both the big boolean, the bass pad switch, and also the Singing Shot. So that was an example of combining two of my keys to make it, a more complex lock that the player has to understand and solve for. This room's got a bunch of these bass pads with a lot of false paths. It's supposed to be kind of overwhelming. The player should probably need to experiment a little bit to see where each of these bass pads lie. But of course, with the walkthrough here, I'm just going golden path. Now this room is the third room in the series, where first the player learns about hedrons, and then the player learns about the heavy hit switches, and now they're left with this puzzle where we've got two rotating platforms and some elevation choices with these glowing blue platforms. The idea is that the player maybe tries to experiment in getting these pads lined up so that they can jump heavily on the switch. After a bit of experimentation, it might become clear to them that there isn't actually a way that they can get enough height. And so the real solve is to actually combine a couple of the components of the dungeon, making the hedron itself land on the pad. And that's why I added the lines above the hedrons. I wasn't sure if this puzzle was fair without them. I was really happy when I saw playtesters solve that on their own for the first time. And that's it. So that's my dungeon. One of the big problems that I had was because I was using blockout art, I had this ambiguity problem where players, especially in those square rooms with a door on each side, they look very similar when you're walking in and out. So I did what I could with lighting to try to draw the focus for players in the directions that they should go. I also did a bit of using the light to indicate or to foreshadow what's on the other side of the door. So outside of the room with all of the blinking platforming pads, the light there cycles through all the hues in a rainbow pattern. If I have base pads on the other side of a door, I'll usually have the light outside that door pink or red to remind the player that, oh yeah, that's where all those base pads were. Another problem I think this dungeon has is I didn't play with elevation as much as I could have. I could have done some fun things where I required the player to use the base pad to launch themselves upward onto a separate plane, and I have that occasionally, but I could have gone a little further. This all has to do with this blockout idea. I had created a room template object that I used to create many of the rooms, and I think I kind of got too sucked into my tools. The template was square, so a lot of my rooms ended up being square or close to a square. You'll notice from this early footage that my dungeon did get a lot more interesting shape-wise, and given more time, that's definitely an area I would continue to focus on. It took me a while to figure out what the big boolean of this dungeon was going to be. I brainstormed a lot with some other ideas that had to do with music. I think if I envision this being a single dungeon in a multi-dungeon game, that each dungeon would use a different musical concept as their big boolean. In this case, I used the bass boost, but other ideas that I had that would affect the music and also the space were distortion or delay or echo. Imagine if you pushed a block, but if you had echo on, the block would go 2 times as far. Or perhaps if you had delay on, that push block wouldn't move until a second or 2 later, allowing you to climb on top of it and then be carried to where you want to go. That could make for some cool puzzles. Looking at the Book of Lenses, I thought a lot about the essential experience of my dungeon. If I just extracted these big Boolean ideas, echo, bass boost, delay, into an entirely condensed puzzle experience, I don't even need all of the Zelda tropes. I don't need the keys, I don't need the sword. Why did I do that? Mostly because I love Zelda and I just wanted to give it a go. But I think if I were to apply the lens of essential experience responsibly, I could just extract that core token of gameplay and do something with that alone. You'll notice that the player never actually went back to that first room with the key. That's for a very particular reason. There's only 3 locked doors in this dungeon and there are 4 keys. While I did want backtracking to be a component of the dungeon, I didn't want to require the player to scour every single room in the dungeon. Giving the player these sorts of options leaves the solve open-ended, which allows for a little bit of player agency and expression. It also gives the player a sense of mastery, even if they happen to forget 1 or 2 rooms. So, that's it. I'll link any relevant videos or studies in the description below. My next journal will be on combat feel. We're going to revisit this Tron guy and see how his sword swing works. Thanks for learning with me, and now I'll leave you with some playtester footage.
Oh. Nope. Oh wait, now I turned it off again. Man, that's cool. That's a cool mechanic. Yeah, this looks amazingly well.